Sacramento, the autumn of 1849, ships arriving from Panama and around Cape Horn were unloading passengers by the thousand into a settlement that a year earlier had counted fewer than 1,000 residents. Most carried little more than a shovel, a pan, and directions to a claim someone else had described in a letter home. The overwhelming majority of them would leave California with less money than they had walked in with. That fact is documented in the diaries, the court dockets, and the poorhouse rolls of nearly every mining county in the state, and it sits uneasily against the picture most Americans carry of the gold rush, as a story of miners striking it rich with a lucky pan of gravel. The men who actually built fortunes in California between 1849 and 1855 were rarely the ones digging. They were standing behind counters, driving freight wagons, and selling flour, boots, and canvas at prices that would have been unthinkable back east. Their surnames are still on record in San Francisco and Sacramento city directories, in probate files, and in businesses some of them founded that are still operating today. A handful of those names went on to become household names in American industry. Whether one of them happens to be your own is a question the historical record can actually answer. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Before 1848, the settlement at the mouth of the Sacramento River held only a few hundred people. Yerba Buena, the small port that would soon be renamed San Francisco, was a cluster of adobe buildings and rancho families with no reason to expect the world's attention. Within 2 years, ships from every ocean were anchored in the bay, some abandoned outright by crews who walked off toward the diggings and never came back. The first federal census taken after California became a state in September of 1850 counted just over 92,000 residents, a figure that likely undercounted the mining camps, since so many men were moving between claims when the census takers came through. San Francisco alone had grown from a few hundred residents to a city of roughly 25,000 in that same span, and it kept growing with every new ship. None of those new arrivals brought enough food, tools, or clothing to last them. Everything had to be shipped in, freighted up rivers, or hauled overland by mule, and every leg of that journey added cost. Eggs that sold for pennies back east could bring $1 apiece in a mining camp. A barrel of flour that cost a few dollars in Boston could sell for 10 times that once it reached the Sierra foothills. Miners paid those prices because they had gold dust in their pockets, and no other supplier within 50 miles. A man who found gold still had to buy his beans, his boots, and his blankets from someone, and that someone rarely dug for a living. The fortunes made in California between 1849 and 1855 belonged disproportionately to the merchants standing on the other side of the counter, and the state's business records still carry their names. The clearest illustration of that divide is the two men most directly connected to the discovery itself. John Augustus Sutter had built an agricultural and trading outpost he called New Helvetia at the point where the American River meets the Sacramento, and it was workers building a sawmill for him at Coloma who found flakes of gold in the mill race on the 24th of January, 1848. Sutter tried to keep the discovery quiet. He had cattle, wheat fields, and a functioning settlement, and he understood immediately that a rush of strangers would ruin all of it. He was right. Within a year, his land had been overrun by squatters who ignored his title, his cattle had been slaughtered for meat, his workers had abandoned their jobs to dig for themselves, and his crops went untended. Sutter spent the next 2 decades in lawsuits trying to recover what the rush had taken from him. He was declared bankrupt in 1852, spent years petitioning Congress for compensation that never fully materialized, and died in 1880 in a Pennsylvania hotel room, largely dependent on a small state pension. James Marshall, the carpenter who actually spotted the gold in the mill race, fared no better. He tried his own hand at mining and failed. He tried farming and lost the land to unpaid taxes. The California legislature eventually granted him a modest monthly pension in recognition of the discovery, but it was reduced within a few years and then allowed to lapse. Marshall spent his final years doing blacksmith work near the same river where he had found the flake of gold that started the entire rush, and he died in 1885 with almost nothing to his name. The two men most directly responsible for the gold rush, the one who owned the land and the one who found the gold, both ended their lives poorer than when it began. The money went somewhere else. Loeb Strauss was born in Bavaria and immigrated to New York as a teenager to join his half-brother's wholesale dry goods business. In 1853, by then going by Levi, he traveled to San Francisco to open a West Coast branch of the family firm, J. Strauss Brother and Company. He was not selling gold pans, he was selling the same dry goods every merchant in California needed to move: fabric, thread, combs, handkerchiefs, and heavy canvas and denim used for tents and wagon covers. For nearly 20 years, Strauss ran a solid but unremarkable wholesale business, supplying retailers across the mining regions. The turn that made his name a household word came later, from an unlikely source. In 1872, a Nevada tailor named Jacob Davis wrote to Strauss with an idea: reinforcing the stress points on work trousers with copper rivets, so the pockets would not tear under the weight of tools and ore samples. Davis could not afford the patent fee himself. Strauss paid for it, and the two men were granted a United States patent in May of 1873 for what the filing called an improvement in fastening pocket openings. Riveted denim work pants, sold under the Levi Strauss name, became standard clothing for miners, ranchers, and laborers across the West. The company built on that patent is still headquartered in San Francisco today, more than a century and a half after Strauss first stepped off a ship in the same bay the 49ers had crowded a few years earlier. John Moeller Studebaker was 20 years old and had almost no money when he arrived in Hangtown, the mining camp later renamed Placerville, in 1853. He did not stake a claim. He noticed that miners needed wheelbarrows to move dirt and gravel from their diggings to the sluice boxes, and that nobody nearby was making them in any quantity. Studebaker built wheelbarrows by hand, sold them to miners for cash or gold dust, and kept building more. Family histories and later company accounts put his savings after 5 years of that work at somewhere around $8,000, a substantial sum for a young laborer in that period. In 1858, he returned to South Bend, Indiana, and used that money to buy into the blacksmith and wagon shop his brothers Henry and Clement had started, renamed it H&C Studebaker, and began building farm wagons instead of wheelbarrows. The company grew into the Studebaker Brothers Manufacturing Company, the largest wagon maker in the United States by the 1870s, supplying wagons to the Union Army during the Civil War and to settlers heading west along the same overland routes the Studebaker brothers had once traveled themselves. The firm eventually moved into automobile manufacturing in the early 20th century and remained one of the country's recognized car brands until production ended in 1966. The wheelbarrows built for gold rush miners funded the company's first real capital, and the surname carried a national reputation in manufacturing for more than a century afterward. Domenico Ghirardelli, later anglicized to Domingo, was a confectioner from Rapallo, Italy, who had already tried his hand at business in Uruguay and Peru before hearing about the California discovery. He arrived in 1849, and rather than heading straight for San Francisco, opened a store in the southern mining district near Stockton, selling provisions, tools, and imported sweets to miners working the Mormon diggings. He lost most of his inventory to at least one of the fires that regularly swept through the wood and canvas mining camps, a common hazard for merchants of the period. He relocated to San Francisco and, in partnership with a fellow Italian merchant named Girard, opened a store dealing in chocolate, spices, and coffee. The partnership eventually dissolved, and Ghirardelli continued alone, founding what became the Ghirardelli Chocolate Manufacturing Company in 1852. The company survived fires, earthquakes, and multiple changes of location before settling into the waterfront building complex in San Francisco that still carries the family name as Ghirardelli Square, now one of the city's recognized landmarks. Ghirardelli never mined an ounce of gold. His fortune came from recognizing that thousands of men living in tents and boarding houses far from home and working brutal physical hours would pay well for coffee, spices, and a piece of chocolate that reminded them of somewhere else. 4 Sacramento merchants built fortunes during the gold rush that would later reshape the entire country. Leland Stanford arrived in California in 1852 and ran a general store supplying groceries and mining equipment, first in the town of Michigan Bluff and later in Sacramento itself. Collis Huntington ran a hardware business in Sacramento, selling picks, shovels, blasting powder, and rope to men heading into the foothills. Mark Hopkins was Huntington's business partner in a wholesale grocery and hardware firm known as Huntington and Hopkins. Charles Crocker operated a dry goods store nearby, selling clothing and fabric to the same customers. All 4 men were already established, moderately wealthy Sacramento merchants, not miners, by the time the 1850s ended. In 1861, the 4 of them pooled their merchant fortunes to organize the Central Pacific Railroad Company, taking on the financial risk of building the western half of the first Transcontinental Railroad through the Sierra Nevada. The railroad was completed in 1869, and the men who financed it, still remembered in California business history as the Big Four, became some of the wealthiest individuals in the United States. Stanford went on to serve as governor of California and later a United States senator, and in 1885 he and his wife Jane founded Leland Stanford Junior University in memory of their son, who had died of typhoid fever at age 15. The university that carries the family name today traces its founding money back through the railroad, and the railroad money traces back through 4 dry goods and hardware counters in Sacramento that sold shovels to men who were digging for something the shopkeepers themselves never touched. The pattern holds up across dozens of smaller fortunes as well. Men who ran stables, laundries, boarding houses, freight lines, and assay offices in towns like Sonora, Nevada City, Grass Valley, and Columbia appear again and again in county tax records from the 1850s as some of the wealthiest property holders in their district, despite never having filed a mining claim themselves. A laundry operator in a camp with 3,000 miners and almost no women could charge prices that would have seemed absurd anywhere else in the country, and the historical record shows several who did exactly that. An assay office that weighed and certified gold dust for a fee handled the output of dozens of claims a week and took its cut regardless of which individual miner walked out lucky. Freight operators who ran mule trains and later stagecoach lines between the coast and the diggings charged by the pound and by the mile, and demand for that service never slowed even when a particular gulch or riverbed played out. The merchants, unlike the miners, were not gambling on any single claim paying off. They were selling to every miner in the district at once, which meant their income was tied to the overall volume of people arriving in California rather than to the luck of any one man with a pan. That distinction explains why the surnames that endured in American business history from this period belong almost entirely to shopkeepers, freighters, and bankers rather than to the men who actually panned the gravel. County probate records from the period bear this out with uncomfortable clarity, listing modest estates worth a few $100s for miners who died in camp against estates worth tens of thousands of dollars for merchants in those same towns. The gold rush also drew merchants from far beyond the United States, and many of the era's most successful supply operations were run by immigrants who had no stake in any mining claim at all. Chinese merchants established supply stores, restaurants, and laundries in San Francisco and in mining towns throughout the Sierra foothills, serving both Chinese and non-Chinese miners, and several of those firms grew into substantial import and trading businesses that outlasted the rush itself by decades. French, Chilean, and German merchants ran comparable operations, importing goods through San Francisco's harbor and distributing them inland at a markup that reflected the difficulty of the journey rather than the cost of the goods themselves. Boarding houses and hotels followed the same logic. A hotel keeper in a camp with no permanent housing could charge nightly rates that would have seemed extravagant in any established American city, and demand rarely slackened, since a miner needed somewhere to sleep whether his claim was paying or not. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Economic historians who have studied surviving account books and diaries from the mining camps have traced a fairly consistent decline in what an average miner could expect to earn as the rush went on. In the earliest months after the Coloma discovery, in the spring and summer of 1848, a man working an unclaimed stretch of riverbed with simple tools could sometimes recover gold worth $15 or $20 in a single day, an extraordinary sum for unskilled labor at the time. Word of those early returns is what pulled tens of thousands of new arrivals into the state through 1849 and into the early 1850s. But every new arrival meant more men competing for the same stretches of river, and the easily accessible surface gold that had made those early returns possible was largely gone within a few years. By the early 1850s, the same economic histories put average daily earnings for an ordinary miner closer to $3 to $6, once food, tools, and camp expenses were subtracted, in a period when those same expenses had climbed sharply because of the prices merchants were charging. Many miners were, in effect, earning less than they were spending, a gap that shows up repeatedly in surviving letters home apologizing for not being able to send money and asking instead for funds to be sent west. The merchants supplying those same miners felt none of that squeeze, since their income rose in step with the number of men arriving rather than falling in step with how much gold remained in any particular stretch of river. Gold dust itself created another layer of guaranteed income that had nothing to do with mining luck. Raw gold dust varied in purity depending on which streambed it came from, so miners needed someone to weigh it, test it, and convert it into a reliable medium of exchange before a store would accept it at face value. Assay offices and private banking houses that sprang up in Sacramento, San Francisco, and the larger mining towns charged a standard fee for that service, typically a small percentage of the gold's assessed value, collected from every miner who walked through the door regardless of how large or small his poke of dust happened to be. Some of those same firms also bought gold dust outright at a discount from its eventual coined value and shipped it east to the federal mint, pocketing the difference. It was a business built on volume and trust rather than on the underlying uncertainty of where the gold had come from, and it produced some of the most consistently profitable operations in the entire territory throughout the 1850s. Samuel Brannan understood the opportunity before almost anyone else in California, and he helped create it. Brannan ran a general store at Sutter's Fort and published California's first newspaper, and when he learned in the spring of 1848 that gold had been found upriver, he did not keep the news quiet the way Sutter had tried to. Brannan first quietly bought up every pick, pan, shovel, and piece of mining equipment he could get his hands on in San Francisco, then walked through the streets of the small settlement holding a vial of gold dust over his head, announcing the discovery to anyone who would listen. Within days, the news had spread, and men were streaming toward the American River. Brannan's stores, positioned along the routes miners had to take to reach the diggings, sold equipment at prices several times what he had paid for it. Accounts from the period describe pans that had cost him a few cents apiece, being sold for several dollars once demand took hold. Brannan is generally regarded as California's first millionaire of the gold rush, and he built most of that wealth before many of the men he sold equipment to had swung a single pick. His later life complicates the tidy version of the story. Brannan expanded aggressively into real estate and other ventures through the 1850s and 60s, but a costly divorce settlement in the early 1870s and a string of poor investments stripped away most of his fortune. He died in 1889 with almost nothing left, a reminder that making a gold rush fortune as a merchant was considerably easier than keeping one across 4 subsequent decades of California's volatile economy. The federal and state records from this period make the imbalance easy to trace for anyone willing to look. County probate files across the mining counties, many of them digitized and searchable today through state archives and genealogical societies, list thousands of estates for men who died in California between 1849 and 1855, with no Survides heirs ever located. Their remaining possessions, a pan, a rifle, a blanket, sold at auction to cover unpaid debts to the merchants who had supplied them. The 1850 and 1860 federal censuses for California list occupation alongside name, and a look through the original schedules for towns like Sonora, Columbia, and Placerville shows the word miner attached to page after page of names, most of whom left no further trace in any later record. Business directories from the same towns, by contrast, list merchants, hotel keepers, and freight operators by name across multiple years running, evidence their operations survived and grew while individual mining claims changed hands every season. One name that often gets folded into this story deserves a more careful placement. George Hearst did travel to California during the gold rush, and he did eventually build an enormous fortune in Western mining, but the bulk of that fortune came a decade later from investments in Nevada's Comstock lode silver deposits in the early 1860s, not from panning gold in California in 1849. His son, William Randolph Hearst, later built the newspaper empire that made the family name famous nationally. The Hearst fortune belongs to the broader story of Western mining wealth, but the Surnames' rise to riches ran on a different timeline than Strauss, Studebaker, Ghirardelli, Stanford, Crocker, Armour, or Brannan, whose fortunes were made supplying the 1849 rush directly. Philip Danforth Armour was 20 years old when he left New York for California in 1852, drawn by the same reports of easy gold that pulled in tens of thousands of other young men that year. He did try mining directly for a period and, like most who did, found little to show for it. Armour's break came when he noticed that miners working claims along a stretch of the Yuba River needed a reliable water supply to run their sluice boxes and rocker devices, and that digging and maintaining a ditch to bring that water in was work most miners had neither the time nor the patience for. Armour and a group of partners built and operated a water ditch, selling access to miners by the day or by the season. It was unglamorous, physically demanding work, cutting and maintaining miles of ditch through hillside terrain, but it produced steady income, independent of whether any particular claim downstream struck gold that week. Armour saved his earnings, returned to the Midwest by the late 1850s, and eventually went into the grain and meatpacking business, first in Milwaukee and then in Chicago, where he built Armour and Company into one of the largest meatpacking firms in the country by the end of the century. Armour later credited his years running the water ditch in California with teaching him the principle that guided the rest of his career, that there was more reliable money in supplying a large population's steady needs than in chasing any single windfall. Henry Wells and William Fargo built their fortune on a different unmet need entirely, moving money and mail safely and quickly between California and the rest of the country. Miners who struck gold faced a real problem once they had it, getting the gold itself, or its value, back home to family or into a bank the miner actually trusted. In 1852, Wells and Fargo organized Wells Fargo and Company to provide banking and express delivery services throughout the California mining region, buying gold dust from miners at a set rate, shipping it securely, carrying mail faster than the government postal service could manage in the chaotic early years of the territory, and later running stagecoach lines connecting remote camps to the coast. The company charged fees for every one of those services, collected from thousands of customers regardless of how any individual miner's claim was performing that month. Wells Fargo survived the collapse of dozens of competing express and banking firms during the financial panics of the 1850s, in part because its income was spread across an entire regional economy rather than tied to the fortunes of any single mining district. The company that began as a response to gold rush chaos is still one of the largest banks in the United States today, carrying the same two surnames on its branches that appeared on stagecoaches rattling between Sacramento and the Sierra foothills a century and three-quarters ago. Sharing one of these surnames does not by itself prove descent from the men described here. Strauss, Stanford, Crocker, Armour, and Hearst were common names in their countries of origin long before these particular individuals were born, and many unrelated families carry them by pure coincidence. The archival record offers a starting point rather than proof. State archives in Sacramento hold digitized versions of the 1850 and 1860 census schedules, along with county probate records, mining claim registries, and surviving business directories from towns across the gold country. Genealogical societies in California counties that were mining centers, El Dorado, Tuolumne, Nevada, and Calaveras among them, maintain indexes built specifically to help descendants trace an ancestor who may have passed through during the rush, whether that ancestor mined, ran a store, drove freight, or simply passed through on the way to somewhere else. A surname search through those records will not settle whether a specific family descends from Levi Strauss or the Studebaker brothers, since fame and fortune were the exception even among merchants. It can turn up an ancestor's name attached to a specific claim, a specific store ledger, or a specific probate file, which is often more than a family story passed down at a kitchen table can provide on its own. Beyond county offices, several larger repositories hold Gold Rush-era records openly to the public. The Bancroft Library at the University of California, Berkeley, maintains one of the largest collections of primary source material from this period, including business ledgers, personal correspondence, and mining company records. The California State Library in Sacramento holds newspaper archives from mining town presses that regularly printed merchant advertisements, business dissolutions, and probate notices, often the only surviving trace of a small operation that never grew into a household name. The National Archives holds federal census schedules and land patent records that can place a specific ancestor in a specific township during a specific year. None of these collections require a family to already suspect a connection to a well-known name. They simply require a surname and a rough sense of where in California that name might have been active between 1848 and 1855. Sutter, Marshall, Strauss, Studebaker, Ghirardelli, Stanford, Crocker, Huntington, Hopkins, Armour, Brannan, and the Wells Fargo name are only the examples large enough to have survived in national memory. Thousands of smaller merchant families made the same calculation and left a smaller but equally traceable record behind them. Across every case documented here, from Sutter losing his land, to Brannan making, and then losing a fortune to 4 Sacramento shopkeepers who ended up financing a transcontinental railroad, gold itself was rarely the asset that mattered. The real asset was reaching a captive population of cash-flush strangers before anyone else did, and continuing to sell to them regardless of which individual claim paid off that week. Sutter owned the land where it all began and died in a hotel room living on a pension. Marshall found the first flake and died doing blacksmith work. The men whose names survived in American business, on blue jeans, on wagons and automobiles, on a university, on a chocolate company, and on a bank that still exists today, were almost without exception the ones who sold shovels rather than swung them. The gold itself mostly left California a long time ago, melted into coin, spent, and passed down in forms no living descendant could trace back to a specific claim. What survived far better than the gold was the paperwork. Ledgers, tax rolls, city directories, and probate files do not care whether the name in them belonged to someone who struck it rich or someone who lost everything trying. They simply recorded who was there and what that person owned when the record was made. For a merchant family, that record often shows steady growth year over year. For a mining family, it often shows a single entry and then nothing further, a name that appears once in an 1850 census and is never seen in California again. Both kinds of records still exist, sitting in county archives right now, open to anyone with a family surname and enough patience to look. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.